So today we're going to make a kinetic cosplay of Okarun's Turbogranny form. So that means I wanted to have some sort of movement or motion to it, specifically in the hair, because when Okarun goes turbo, his hair moves and ripples like it's blowing in the breeze. And we're going to try to replicate that in cosplay form. Starting with the mask, unfortunately I already have a 3D scan of my head, so I can sculpt around that really easily. I started by wrapping the general mask shape around my head, and then I could add teeth one by one. I added this center line going through to mimic kind of a grin look on the teeth, and I was able to shape the teeth to that line. As I was sculpting the teeth, I also had to make sure that they were pointing inward rather than just going straight up and down, because that better matches the source material. I added these ledges on either side so that the mask could better rest on my face and also help cover my beard. I felt that the teeth were looking a little plain on their own, so I decided to use the crease tool to add a gum line above and below each of the teeth. And I went over this line a few times just to make it really pronounced, and I think it makes the mask look really uncanny in a good way. I think it actually looks a lot like either Batman Who Laughs or Ichigo's Hollow Mask, and either way, I really dig this vibe. Unfortunately, there isn't a ton of reference for what the back of the mask looks like, and I think that's because it's also kind of flowing nebulously in the air from the yokai transformation, so to mimic that, I kind of pointed several sections out in this ethereal sort of manner, and I think it looks pretty good this way. I made sure to refer to this X-ray view throughout the process just to make sure that the mask wasn't going to press against my face. Then I added these two brackets in the back where I can attach an elastic strap, which will stretch across the back of my head, and then two slots in the upper portion here for a strap that will go over the top of my head. And we are done. If you are enjoying the Nomad Sculpt content, subscribe to the channel because there is plenty more where that came from, including Mikau's fishbone guitar and Japaz's crab bass from Majora's Mask. Check out the full build videos on my channel for those. But in the meantime, it's time to get Okarun's mask from the digital world to the physical one. Let's get it printed. And get it printed I did. This print was absolutely no trouble for the X1 Carbon. I just had a couple of supports that I needed to remove from where the gum line was stretching over the teeth, and that was no trouble at all. After that, I could add a couple of neodymium magnets just with a little bit of super glue in these cavities that I created, one in the top and one in the bottom, and that actually holds the mask together pretty securely. For the straps, it was as simple as sliding them through those brackets, adding a bead of super glue to one end, and then doubling over the strap onto itself just to hold everything nice and tight. And it is the exact same process for the strap that goes over the top of my head as well. Moving on to the painting, I actually have this really thin masking tape that I'm using to just go over the border of the teeth and the gums here, and you can see I've already started on that. I use thicker masking tape on the areas where I don't need to be as delicate and accurate with my lines. And the painting process is pretty standard. I start, of course, with a filler primer just to fill in some of those layer lines on the teeth, just so I can get them nice and smooth and shiny. Bonus points if you can guess in the comments what I painted on this board last, and you might just see a video on it soon. Now back to the project. I really don't care if there's a little bit of texture from the layer lines on the other part of the mask. After that has had some time to dry, I did notice one spot of under extrusion on one of these teeth here, so I'm just using some of that spot putty to fill that in, and then I'll paint over that with the filler primer as well. And what better paint to use on the teeth than a white gloss enamel? Seems kind of fitting, so we'll go with that. Enamel's really nice because it's super durable, but you do want to make sure that each layer of this has enough time to off-gas and fully cure, but shouldn't be a problem with this particular print. And now the fun part. Honestly, I find that masking can be kind of an annoying and tedious process, but removing the masking after you've done some painting is really fun and kind of makes it all worth it. You may notice a couple of areas where the enamel paint actually bled through the masking tape, and a couple of other areas on the teeth where I didn't get great coverage, but I'm just taking a paint pen and covering up some of those spots. Just a couple of touch-ups on the teeth and on the black area surrounding, and it is looking good. And now that I'm done stalling with the mask, we can move on to the hair, which is actually going to be the kinetic portion of the cosplay. So you can see I've got this white hat here, and it is going to be my base. So I'm just cutting off the brim here and using the rest of it as a foundation to build off of and hold the hair onto my head. So the actual hair is going to be made from anything I was able to find at the craft store that was white, lightweight, and flowy. And these white ostrich feathers are going to be a great start for that. They're conveniently sold in this length of fabric, so all I'm going to do is use some hot glue to wrap this around the entirety of the hat piece and a couple of different layers to build up some density. And my idea is that these feathers are lightweight enough to introduce some movement passively into the hairpiece. And then I can add an additional source of movement, but more on that later. Now that I have some good coverage from the ostrich feathers, I can go ahead and create a sort of retaining wall with the rooster feathers. I'm using those to kind of act as a support to guide the other feathers upward into the shape that I'm looking for, rather than spilling out over the side. Most of this part is me trying to walk the line between chaotic and organized to have enough of a structure to look like Okarun, but also have enough freedom to move around and flow. You can see in this quick test fit how one side has everything much more contained, and the side without the retaining feathers is all over the place, in my face, really unstructured, and not looking too great. Next, I'm using some of that faux fur to create the back portion of the hair that would drop down from where the hat ends on the back of my head. And I'm going to add more rooster feathers to this to make it look a little more cohesive. I got a little carried away at this part and neglected to film it, but you can see that I've added a sort of cone of a stiffer goose feather to create kind of a support structure for the rest of the pointed hairdo that Turbo Okarun has. And very importantly, this support cone is actually hollow on the inside, so I can add more of those rooster feathers around the outside to build up that hairdo, and the inside can be put to use later. And I'm only gluing these feathers down at the base so that the tops of them can still flow in the breeze. So from here I just continue that process of adding feathers one by one, sticking them down and making everything look nice and cohesive, all the while trying to build up what looks like the hairdo that Okarun is using in his turbo form. Of course, Okarun does not just have white hair, there are also streaks of red, so I do have these red feathers that I'm going to be adding strategically to mimic that look. And this process is done in much the same way, just taking feathers and adding them in places that I think they would look nice. No rhyme or reason, no pattern that I'm following, just where I think there could be some red. And at this point you can start to see how everything is starting to look a lot more full and filled out, and I have a lot more of those rooster feathers covering the entirety of the hairpiece. Finally, I'm taking a couple of those stiffer goose feathers and bending them in a way that mimics the kind of hair strands that stick down in front of Okarun's face. So I'm just gluing those on kind of like this. And I know that he does have more than just two of these strands coming down from the side of his face, but I'm just going to stick with these two so that they don't block any of the airflow. Speaking of which, how are we going to add that air? I already talked about the passive movement of the air that's going to happen naturally. Hopefully you saw that during the demonstration. And that's going to work anytime that I'm walking or moving my head. But I do want to add another source of air that can be helping the hair move when I'm stationary. So I figure that I can borrow the arms of Okarun's glasses to help with that. So I drew up a quick model of those arms that is hollow on the inside, and then I added some of these holes along the top at an angle that should be pointing towards the side of the hairpiece. That way I can pump air through the glasses, moving towards the flowy parts of the hair. While those were printing, I could go ahead and cut off the old arms in preparation for the new ones. These I just got off of Amazon. Attaching them is as simple as putting a blowtorch to the metal ends for just a couple of seconds to get them hot enough to melt into the PLA plastic, which basically holds itself in place, but I added some super glue for some added strength. So here are Okarun's glasses fully printed and assembled. You can see that I made the tips of the glasses arms just the right diameter to fit some vinyl tubing over, and that tubing will carry the air into the hollow section of the arms and then out through these holes up towards the hairpiece. And here are some of the ways that we could provide that air. First off, just a bit of a joke answer. I was talking to a friend about adding a fan and funneling that into the end of the glasses. And this is just a bit of a gag. There's no way this would ever work to provide the amount of air pressure at these holes that we would need. But for the real answers, it started with this pump for an air mattress. You can see where it was just cut out of the air mattress material. And this pump actually provides a decent amount of air, although it is quite loud when it does that. But it all comes from this large hole here. So I went ahead and modeled a plug for that hole and printed it out of TPU just so that it can smush in a little bit and create a good seal. And that plug just diverts the air from the one hole into the two channels that go to each side of the glasses. So I'm going to plug that in and turn it on really quick, but it is quite loud, so I'll have to talk about it after the fact. So you can see there was a decent amount of air that actually came out through the glasses. It's not that powerful though, and as soon as I turn the pump off, that air stops, which we'll get back to. But it's also quite heavy, it's quite loud, it has to be plugged in. It didn't seem like the best solution. So I got out my compressor for my airbrush, and I noticed actually that this hole on the underside of this plug very nicely fits into this fitting on the airbrush. And it's actually quite quiet. Hopefully you could hear that there was still air passing through the system after I turned it off. And I think that's because the compressor does a better job of pressurizing this system and adding more air, which in turn puts more air through these holes. And I think the feather test did a decent job of demonstrating that as well. But I can just personally attest that there is a lot more air coming out of these holes with the compressor compared to the air mattress pump. And I think that's good. Of course, you would never take this to a convention. This would be more for like a video shoot or some sort of setup like that, where you could have this behind you and operating while you're filming or whatever, but you would never want to walk around with this. For that, I actually have this idea. This is another air pump for like pool inflatables. And there are a variety of fittings that you can put on the output here. And conveniently, this fitting actually fits the rubber stopper quite well. And this one's also quite loud, so I'll do another demonstration and show how it works, and then I'll talk about it after. So it was hard to find a place where the feather was reacting how I wanted it to, but it actually puts out about as much air as, well, somewhere in between these two options. So this is something you could have attached to you. There's actually a hook on the underside. And it does vent air out the bottom as well. So it's blowing here and pulling in air through here. So that does change some things. But if you wanted to take this to a convention, that would be one way of doing it. Of course, I would better tailor this fit if I were to do that. But for my purposes, I think I'm going to stick with the compressor plus a hidden secret weapon. And that is actually a battery-powered fan. I think this will be my ace in the hole for my setup. It actually puts out a good amount of air, 3 different settings. It's relatively quiet, and it actually fits in that hollow compartment of the hair that I built in with those stiffer feathers. So I'll have the air coming from the outside through the glasses, air coming from the inside going through the feathers to the upper portion of the hair, and I should be able to get what I'm hoping is a decent amount of movement. And since this is pink, it does not bleed through. You can't see it through the hair, so I think that'll be a good solution for my purposes. So I'll be honest, I was going to quit here. I had the hair, the glasses, and the mask planned, but really nothing past that. I don't exactly have the body type for an Okarun cosplay, but I thought about it, and 1, it would be deeply unsatisfying to get this far and not see it through, and 2, who cares? Anyone can cosplay anything, so I am going to finish the cosplay, at least put together some sort of an outfit to tie it all together and see what it all looks like. And from what I can tell, that really comes down to the school uniform that Okarun wears most of the time. And when he goes turbo, a couple of things happen to that uniform. For one, the collar grows, it gets longer, kind of points upward and turns red at the tips. And two, the coat tails, or I guess shirt tails at the back also grow, get longer, and turn red at the tips. Then there's the change in skin color, the eye paint, and then somehow magically he loses his shoes and his pants get rolled up. So we're going to go for all of those things. And I'm a little bit of a hoarder, so for the shirt tails, I'm actually going to be using this old cape from a childhood Halloween costume. I cut it down into a better shape, and then I sealed the tips with some Mod Podge. Then I spray painted it all red, and where it was sealed at the tips, you can see that the red came out really saturated and vibrant, and where it wasn't sealed, it kind of blends into the fabric and creates this nice looking gradient. Then I used the excess fabric cut off from the cape in the same method to make the extending collar. You might be able to see the seam on the top here where I stitched in a little pocket to hold the collar in place, and what's going through that pocket is actually some metal coat hanger wire that I bent through the collar so that it would hold the fabric outward towards the back of my head. The coat hanger wire is malleable enough to fish through the collar, but stiff enough to hold the fabric nice and rigid. And I have some black pants to use as well. So I have the hair, the glasses, the mask, the outfit, and some face paint to sell the look. So here is my rendition of Turbo Okarun.
Yeah, I'm surging with power now. Feeling pretty gloomy though. Sorry, I'm an awkward guy, yo. AF. Turbogranny powers rock, yo, but I'm still bummed.
Well, that was fun. Maybe I can find a convention somewhere so that I can actually wear it out. And now that I'm seeing the face paint, actually a Kratos cosplay might be a little more appropriate. So maybe one day. But I need to wash all this face paint off, so let me do some editing magic and I'll be right back. Much better. Now, for the big list of projects, I just have this generally listed as cosplay. I knew I wanted to do some sort of cosplay. I didn't know it would be Okarun, but the second season of Dandadan came out and I figured, why not? And I really like how it came out. And I don't think it'll be my last foray into the world of cosplay, so we may hit up this category again sometime. In fact, I was thinking next I might do Seiko ISA. I'm kidding. In all seriousness, thank you so much for making it to the end and for joining me on this one. Special thanks to Thomas Computes and Thad Carpenter for being my top members this month. I really appreciate your support. And if you have any interest in supporting the channel, check out my memberships because there might be a tier that you're interested in, including one where you can get all of my 3D printing files. That includes Okarun's mask, both of the guitars that I've worked on, and anything I've got coming up in the future. And if you can't support financially, that is totally okay too. It means the world that you have watched this far. It would mean even more to me if you subscribe to the channel. I do think I'm going to be working on some stuff in the future that you're going to want to see. Until then, take it easy. I'll see you next time. Oh snap, you made it to the end. Hopefully that means you enjoyed. If so, click the circle to subscribe. And you might also like this other video. I'm making a guitar from Majora's Mask.